When it comes to late at night, supernatural beings appear in the city. Humans can't see them, and they don't usually provoke humans, but whenever they harm a human, a special division steps in. That is the Shinjuku Ward Nocturnal Community Relations Division. Recently, multiple girls have mysteriously disappeared in the city, but before long, they all reappeared. This immediately caught the attention of the Shinjuku Ward Nocturnal Community Relations Division. They located one of the victims, Sora, from her account. At the moment she was taken, everything suddenly went pitch black. Tiny black particles floated around her, and she felt an unbearable discomfort in her throat. Investigator Sakaki asked Sora to try singing a song, but despite being a member of the school choir, she couldn't sing a single note. Seeing this, Sakaki was certain she had lost her ability to sing. Shortly after, Sakaki received a call from his colleague. Another victim had woken up, but she had completely lost sensation in her right leg. Hearing this, Sakaki immediately realized the culprit behind these cases had to be a supernatural entity, because his own sister had vanished before his very eyes. That was the very reason he joined the Shinjuku Ward Nocturnal Community Relations Division. So far, every girl who had gone missing mentioned seeing black sand before they were taken. Sakaki suspected it was the same perpetrator. Then, he suddenly remembered. The Chaos God, Amber, once mentioned a friend who had a bizarre obsession with collecting women. Sakaki asked his colleague Miyako to question Amber. Perhaps they could uncover some useful information. The next day, Miyako was out with her childhood friend, Mika, but suddenly, a mysterious figure attacked them. Miyako could only watch helplessly as Mika was dragged away into the dark mist. In a panic, Miyako desperately called out for Amber, begging him to help. But Amber didn't want Miyako involved. It was far too dangerous. In the end, under Miyako's relentless insistence, Amber reluctantly revealed a rough location where the mysterious figure might be hiding. Without wasting time, Miyako, Sakaki, and Himetsuka launched their investigation. After some digging, they identified the figure's movement patterns, all of them centered around girls' schools. Miyako had once heard from Amber that the mysterious figure would perform a ritual before dawn. Time was running out. The three of them quickly searched the area around the schools. Just then, Amber suddenly appeared. He warned them, if they valued their lives, they should stay out of this. But Miyako was determined. Amber sighed. He told them, if they could get past the annoying watchdog, they might actually have a chance. Finally, Amber decided to help them reach the figure's hideout. Their hearts pounded as they stepped inside. Every door in that place led to different parts of the world, and some straight into the depths of hell. Amber began to tell the story of the mysterious figure. His name was Azazel. He was once an angel, but he fell in love with a human girl, Yuna. For that, he was cast out of heaven. He descended, becoming a demon. Azazel and Yuna had promised to be together forever, but after Yuna's death, Azazel devised a twisted way to bring her back, and that was, he planned to assemble the perfect lover by piecing together body parts from different girls. Meanwhile, Mika's left hand had gone completely numb. Azazel had stolen its ability and transferred it to Yuna. This time, Azazel was certain he would succeed. At the same time, Amber led the group to the watchdog, and that watchdog was none other than the legendary Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell. The four of them turned and ran, but it wasn't long before Cerberus cornered them. Just as Miyako was about to be devoured, Amber suddenly spoke. He's mine. Get lost. Cerberus immediately backed away, clearly terrified of Amber. At that moment, the resurrection ritual had entered its final stage. There, Miyako found Mika and Sakaki. He finally saw his sister, who had been missing for 10 years. Enraged, he fired his gun at Azazel, but in an instant, a demon appeared behind them and restrained all three. The demon warned them they were not to interfere with the ritual. Azazel was now at the final step. Yuna's eyes slowly opened, but instead of joy, she was filled with rage. She felt sick, disgusted that her soul had been placed in a stranger's flesh. Azazel begged her to adjust, to return to the way she once was, but Yuna's fury only grew stronger. She didn't want this. She only wanted to sleep forever. Azazel couldn't bear to see her in pain, so he made his decision. He would let her rest once more. The demon released Miyako and the others, then opened a portal sending them all away. Sakiki's sister woke up, but she had lost her eyes. Even so, she immediately recognized Sakiki's voice. At the same time, Azazel returned everything that had been taken from the other girls. Sakiki's sister's sight was restored, but Azazel had not given up. That day, the Shinjuku Ward Nocturnal Community Relations Division received a report. Countless cocoons had been discovered at a stadium. They were severely obstructing construction progress. The team immediately launched an investigation. Miyako possessed the ability known as Ears of Sand. It was said that this ability allowed him to understand the language of supernatural beings. However, Takeda was highly skeptical. He proposed a challenge. If Miyako couldn't solve the case using Ears of Sand, then Takeda would personally destroy the creatures. Miyako peeled open one of the cocoons, but all he heard was the cry of an infant. There was no way to communicate. Takeda took this as proof. Miyako was incapable of solving the case, so he decided, tomorrow, he would deal with the cocoons in his own way. Miyako was filled with despair, because he could feel the life inside those cocoons. Just then, Amber appeared. He had been watching the situation closely, and he revealed this might be related to a recent festival. Amber was eagerly anticipating the event. The more he spoke, the more excited he became. He completely ignored Miyako's concerns. Then, without warning, he took off into the sky. Miyako couldn't shake his unease about the cocoons, so he called on Sakiki and Himetsuka for help. The three of them analyzed Amber's words. Sakiki and Himetsuka believed the festival Amber mentioned was likely a gathering of gods, a day when all deities assembled, and those cocoons, they were probably offerings for the gods at the festival. If their theory was correct, then the cocoons were incredibly important. Meanwhile, Takeda had already arrived at the stadium with his team. He planned to eradicate the cocoons using talismans, but there were too many. They had to paste the talismans one by one. Above them, Amber watched in distress, because those cocoons were the raw materials for his clothing. The exorcists kept placing talismans, unaware of the disaster about to unfold. Suddenly, screams erupted. Everyone on site was under attack. As humans, they were no match for the terrifying force before them. Takeda turned around, and what he saw left him speechless. A towering figure stood before him, the mother of all these cocoons, the silkworm god, Manari. Meanwhile, a surviving colleague frantically called Miyako. Everyone else had turned into cocoons. Only he remained. Miyako decided he would use Ears of Sand to communicate with Manari, hoping to convince her to release his colleagues. But Himetsuka strongly objected. He believed that Manari was far too dangerous, and that nothing could stop her now. Still, Miyako was determined. He had to save them. At the same time, Takeda managed to escape his cocoon, using a barrier stone. These stones possessed the power to weaken supernatural beings. Without hesitation, Takeda threw 4 more stones, sealing Manari in place. Her eyes burned with rage. Just then, Miyako arrived, stopping Takeda in his tracks. Miyako warned him, if he continued, a great catastrophe would follow. At that moment, their superiors intervened. He ordered Takeda to leave immediately. Takeda had no choice but to comply. Miyako then stepped forward and began to speak with Manari. From her, he learned the truth. These cocoons are all her children. They wove silk, and when they emerged, they would refine their own silk into the finest threads in the world. These silks were meant to be gifts for the gods, but Takeda's reckless interference had ruined everything. There wasn't enough time now. By sunrise, the silk had to be delivered. If the offering was not made, Manari would be unable to receive the sun's power. She wouldn't survive the winter. Miyako hadn't realized the situation was far more severe than he had thought. Manari's frustration grew, and she made her decision. She would kill everyone here. In that desperate moment, Miyako declared he would help her complete the offering. He promised that the silk would reach the gods in time. Manari saw the determination in his eyes, and decided she would trust him. Without wasting a second, Miyako called on all his colleagues, but time was against them. Only 30 minutes remained until sunrise. Just then, the sky shifted. 2 forces approached. The Crow Tengu and the Angels. Miyako had summoned them for help. No one had expected this. Supernatural beings and humans. working together in harmony. Only Miyako could have made this happen. After everyone had finished sorting the silk, the angels began to weave. The scene was grand and filled with beauty. And finally, with everyone's concerted efforts, the task was completed. The timing was just right. And Manari also returned to her original state. The processed silk was neatly packaged by Manari, and then she flew up into the sky with her children. Amber also received a coveted piece of clothing, and he planned to wear it to attend the Festival of the Gods. There is a legend in Japan about a certain type of vampire, usually male. They only drink blood during their breeding season, allowing them to change gender and fulfill their mission of reproduction. 100 years ago, people greatly feared these vampires, and carried out a brutal extermination campaign against their species. However, a recent supernatural case has once again rekindled humanity's terror, but these vampires had long since gone extinct. Yet, upon analyzing the bite marks on the victims' necks, investigators found them to be eerily similar to those of this extinct vampire species. At that moment, Himetsuka suddenly spoke up. He said that, in fact, the last of these vampires still existed in Japan. Her name was Haru. Himetsuka had secretly observed Haru for 15 years. In all that time, he had never seen her harm a single person. She was merely waiting for her life to come to an end, alone. This was something Himetsuka only confided to those he trusted, but he didn't realize that. Just outside the door, Koda from another department had overheard everything. The next day, Koda brought Himetsuka and Miyako along. He insisted they find the last of these legendary vampires. Koda claimed he had already reported the matter to higher-ups and obtained their approval. Himetsuka had no choice but to cooperate. Himetsuka explained that vampires were extremely vulnerable to water. That's why there have never been any new species of vampires appearing in this area. Haru was the sole survivor of the massacre that took place a century ago. She was terrified of humans. Even when she saw Himetsuka, her eyes were filled with wariness. Soon, they arrived at Haru's residence. The place was unchanging through all 4 seasons. Cherry blossoms bloomed all year round. When Himetsuka opened the door, he was stunned by the scene before him. The room was covered in blood. Elsewhere, Haru was indeed attacking humans. She had lost all control over herself. She recalled that moment. If only she hadn't opened the door that day. Meanwhile, news of another murdered girl reached Himetsuka. In the victim's hand was an earring. That earring was the very one Himetsuka had lost near Haru's house last year. At that moment, Himetsuka suddenly thought of a man named Hikaru. Hikaru had once admired Himetsuka immensely. Using Himetsuka's inventions, Hikaru had conducted cruel experiments on countless supernatural beings. Hikaru had been a well-known figure in the field of biology, but his methods were far too inhumane. Many supernatural creatures harbored deep hatred toward him. Because of this, Himetsuka went so far as to use the power of the Witch of the West to destroy Hikaru's laboratory. As a result, Hikaru held an undying grudge against Himetsuka. It was highly likely that Hikaru was now seeking revenge. Miyako, with his ability to understand supernatural beings, began a simple investigation. He sought help from various supernatural creatures, but none of them had any information on the case, until Miyako encountered a small fairy. The fairy claimed that a mysterious person had stolen its wings. That person then used the phosphor powder from the wings to help a vampire feed. Based on this, Miyako and his team deduced that the mysterious person's next target would be a park. The 3 of them rushed to the scene, but they were still a step too late. Himetsuka searched the area. He found Haru, barely clinging to life. At that moment, Hikaru suddenly appeared before them. His goal was clear revenge. Then, he stepped back, ready to enjoy the show. Haru leaped forward. At that moment, the only human she still trusted was Himetsuka. Himetsuka wanted Haru to return home and live in peace, but Haru told him it was already too late. She could no longer control herself. Only by finding a mate would her thirst for blood subside. Just then, Haru's body began to change. In the next instant, she lunged at Miyako. At this point, Haru had become an immensely powerful vampire. At any moment, she could completely lose control and turn into a mindless monster. Haru knew this as well. That was why she wanted Himetsuka to kill her while she was still conscious. She didn't want to die at the hands of a stranger. Haru made one final request. she asked Himetsuka to bury her ashes beneath the cherry tree beside her cabin after she died, because that was where the ashes of her kin had been laid to rest. At that moment, Haru suddenly lost control. In an instant, she seized Himetsuka, but then, she caught sight of a familiar earring. Immediately, she snapped back to her senses, but before she could say anything, Kota stabbed her from behind with a dagger. In the end, Haru was unable to fulfill her wish of dying by Himetsuka's hand. Her body faded into the air. Hikaru, on the other hand, was arrested by the reinforcements that had arrived, but instead of fear, he broke into maniacal laughter, because this was the ending he had wanted. But soon, his laughter came to an abrupt stop, for the Witch of the West had arrived at his cell. The Witch of the West told him, "Every life deserves respect, but you are the exception."